Chapter 10. Fish. With a gasp, Machwa awoke, and his eyes snapped open to see the tan tent above. There was silence but for the soft fluttering of tent flaps. He was warm, almost too warm, and when he looked down over his prone form he figured out why. Shimna was laying down atop the blanket he had snuggled under. He let his head fall back against the thick sleeping furs and breathed out a sigh of relief. His ears slid back, and he thought about the fact that Shimna was using him as a bed. He looked around and noticed that the rest of the tent either was or had been full. It did make sense that she had slept next to him because there wasn't room anywhere else, so he forgave her. He moved with care as he wormed his way out from under her. She began to mumble in her sleep, "No, you can't get away, Suchi. I've got you now." He snuck from the tent and stepped out into the morning sunlight to look around, and noticed Saruth spread out upon a rock as though dead. A grin slid across his face as he pondered a prank, and he slipped off his boots and crept closer to Saruth with a stealth he imagined unrivaled. He was going to take his staff and hide it. This would be epic. Just a little closer. Almost there. "Did you sleep well?" "Ack!" Machwa jumped and fell backward off the small boulder he was perched on. He landed with a thud on the shell of the Tortanga below. Saruth opened one eye and looked down over the edge of the rock. "Are you hurt?" Machwa laid his ears back. "No, but I'm thinking about making someone else that way." Saruth laughed, picked up his staff, and stood. "Would you like some breakfast?" Machwa sneezed, growling after. He put his hands on his hips and glared up at Saruth. "What is it?" Saruth pointed at the fish hanging from a stringer between two posts stuck in the nearby ground. "Raw fish?" Machwa made a face at the very idea. Saruth looked down at him and laughed. "Some eat it raw, but that isn't the way I like it. Would you like me to show you how to cook it?" Machwa looked at the fish hanging there and felt that his stomach would revolt at the very idea of eating it raw. He'd done it once, and it was one time too many. The thought seemed to combat his appetite. His stomach spoke to him otherwise on the matter of eating, however. "Okay." He flicked an ear back and then perked both. "Show me." The first bite was delicious. The second was better. Machwa held up the skewered fish in triumph. He looked over the small rock with vials of seasonings on it and nodded to Saruth while licking his lips. Saruth smiled his welcome while he pulled his own breakfast off the spit and began to eat it. The old fat woman with large glasses and reddish fur stepped from the tent as she grumbled about the status of the accommodations in her own tongue. Machwa knew it was coming even before it happened. It was everything he could do not to roll his eyes. Her nose twitched, and she turned to look their way. Her eyes narrowed as she absorbed the delicious scent of food. She walked right over and surveyed the fire area for another fish. Her eyes narrowed further, her expression like a water snake seeing a minnow just under the surface when she spotted another fish cooking on the spit. She looked at Saruth and ignored Machwa. "How soon until mine is ready?" Machwa growled, only to have Saruth hold a hand out in his direction to calm him. "Ma'am, no disrespect intended, but yours shall be ready when you catch and cook it. These are for Machwa and myself. We shall consume them because I obtained them." She stiffened and her fur poked up around her neck. "Do you know who I am?" Saruth offered a disarming smile. "No, I'm afraid I do not. I believe you are from Lathmos, perhaps, but other than that I have no idea." The woman tapped her toe claws on the edge of the Tortanga shell as she looked at them on the bank. "I am Lady Elita de Roth of Kelon. I am from Lathmos, and I am royalty." She said it in a tone one might use to tell another they were deity. Machwa hissed under his breath and whispered to Saruth, "I hate royalty." Saruth placed his hand over Machwa's mouth. "Ah, Lady Elita de Roth, I didn't know we were in the presence of royalty. Allow me to offer you my aid, then, if you would be so kind to a commoner." The woman adjusted her thick glasses. "Much better. Now give me—" Saruth interrupted, feigning ignorance of her talking. "Of course. I'll be happy to help you catch your fish. I'd planned on showing my young charge this anyway, so your timing couldn't have been better." There was a gasp when she was interrupted, and then a growl as Saruth offered his help. She turned her back on Saruth and yelled something in her language at the tent. Soon her two disoriented servants showed up, looking the very painting of someone who had just received a rude awakening. Because he didn't care to understand what she was saying at the time, Machwa's talkie didn't activate to explain it. His tail lashed just from thinking about the ornery woman, and having to travel with her around. Maybe if they got lucky she'd fall off the Tortanga in the middle of the night and no one would care if they saw. He might not say anything. As soon as he thought this, he thought about what Saruth would think about it, and frowned. She pointed to the fish Saruth was turning on the spit, and both of the men's eyes widened. Machwa watched one of them, intent on him and understanding. "My lady, you wish me to steal?" More of her blabbering ensued, her level of energy rising as she lashed her tail and pointed her finger at the man who had asked the question. Saruth lifted a brow as the man walked over and knelt before him. "Sir, might I perhaps buy the fish you are turning? My lady is hungry, and we have misplaced our food portions for this part of the journey." Saruth offered a smile. "Would you like me to show you how to catch more? If she had asked as kindly as you did, I'd have given her the fish. But it's become clear to me that giving her my fish now feeds her bad manners more than it feeds her. I will not take your money, but I will show you how to catch them for free." The woman was right behind the man at the point that Saruth said this, and gave him a kick in the rear end. The man winced and stood up to brush himself off.
"Do not kneel before these riffraff."
She turned to Saruth and spoke in Barumish so sweet it'd make teeth rot.
5 silver pieces for your fish."
Machwa lifted a brow at Saruth. 5 silver pieces was enough to buy 10 fish on the market in Barumith, and if she paid that much, it would be a deal for any merchant. Saruth shook his head. Her tone became less sweet.
10 pieces.
At this point, Machwa wanted to cut the bite marks out of his breakfast and hand it to the woman for a third of that. His eyes went wide as he looked at Saruth, who shook his head. She hissed and her fur stood on end as her servants looked on. Both servants stifled groans as the woman growled at Saruth through her words.
15.
Saruth stood up and pointed toward the water. He handed his fishing lines and kupatha berries to one of the woman's servants, telling him he wanted the equipment back once they were done. Duroth sputtered, somehow seeming unable to comprehend that she didn't get her way. For a moment it looked like she might try to snatch the food or strike Saruth, but when she looked into his eyes, something made her look away.
"Some people are fools that cannot be helped."
She turned and followed her servants that now began fishing on the far side of Cooley and stormed after them. Machwa had great difficulty containing himself, and as soon as she was out of earshot, he let the words fly from his mouth in a hiss.
"Saruth, why? For 5 silver pieces I'd have caught another fish, even though I don't know how."
He felt his ears lay back as he stared at the man with his tail a-quiver. Saruth took a bite from his fish and glanced at him. "Machwa, sometimes a person's compliance cannot be purchased with financial gain or pleasure. These people are stronger than those who can be bought because of the fact that personal gain and power cannot sway them. Sometimes doing the right thing, even when doing otherwise, can make you rich as its own reward. Consider the lessons she might learn from this experience. If I had given her the fish, then she would treat the next person the way she treated me, and the next, and the next. And the same goes for if I'd sold the fish to her. She would never acquire manners because she would feel that due to her status or her money she need not bother with them. When she finds someone she cannot bully with her status or buy with her money, then she comes to a bridge that only manners can aid her in crossing. If she cannot cross that bridge by becoming a bigger person, she will be upset and might have to hunger longer as punishment. In this I do her a service, considering money and power can vanish in a day, but lessons learned are always wealth in the possession of those they render wise." Machwa blinked as he took the words in. He sat in silence for a moment and laid his ears back.
"Well, couldn't we have spared the fish because she was hungry? Isn't it cruel not to be nice and give it to her, or at least give it to her servant so the servants don't get kicked?"
Saruth waggled a finger.
"There's a vast chasm between being kind and being bullied, Machwa. A gift at the point of a blade is not charity. She came to order us to feed her, and doing that to someone you do not rule over is wrong. Even if you do have people under your power, it is always better to ask instead of tell. A king loved by his people is a happy king indeed, and the only way a king can get such love is to treat those subject to him with respect. My heart goes out to the servants for being mistreated, but they have chosen to allow it. They've given her the fish, as it were. It is true that they are in her service, but to my knowledge they could leave if they desired."
Machwa thought about it and nodded. He said nothing for a moment as he looked across the Tortanga and saw them casting the lines in the water on the far side while their lady sat with her ears back against her skull and watched. He had to admit that they had given her the fish, and if it were his choice, he wouldn't now, not for all the money in Baruma's city. Saruth tossed out a line with an easy pitch, and it arced with the weight of the rock on the end so that the kupatha berry on the hook vanished under the murky surface of the water. A moment later he handed the looped end of the woven silk line to Machwa and hunkered down next to him.
"Now, every once in a while give a little tug. It makes the rock move, but it also makes the berry wobble. Kupatha berries usually float, so you have to move it around to spread the smell under the water for the fish."
"The smell? How can anyone smell anything under water?"
Saruth grinned.
"How can anyone smell anything in air?"
Machwa opened his mouth and then just snorted. Saruth couldn't prove he was right, but much to Machwa's ire, he couldn't be proven wrong either. Still, the question had to be asked.
"How do you know, Saruth? Have you ever been a fish?"
Saruth laughed and glanced at the fishing line.
"Keep the line tight. You'll want to feel when the berry is grabbed."
Machwa nodded, and his face went from mirthful to a mask of seriousness. He imagined the fish looking at his kupatha berry down under the water and thinking of just how to steal it without him knowing about it, just as he had once looked at the purses of rich men. Indignation at the thought of his bait being stolen made his tail lash as he sat in concentration and tugged the line a bit every so often in an erratic rhythm. All of a sudden he felt a tug back on the line. Saruth put a hand over his to help him give a yank and set the hook, and then let go. Machwa pulled, and the fish drew back as the struggle began. The servants of Lady de Ross stopped their vain attempts at fishing, watching as Machwa yanked and pulled. He felt the line stretch so tight that he thought notes could be plucked on it. Saruth's muzzle parted in a grin, and he grabbed Machwa's belt so he wouldn't fall off the Tortanga while he did battle with the fish.
"You've got it, Machwa. Keep pulling. Let no slack in the line. Loop it around a forearm."
Machwa growled and lashed his tail as he pulled and felt the fish pull back. He watched the point where the line went into the water zip around on the surface as the powerful animal below fought for its right to live. He felt quite the predator as he worked in lengths of line, waiting until the fish tired a bit and pulling in one loop at a time, shortening the distance between the fish and himself as Saruth had taught him. After a few minutes of hard fighting, it was over, and Machwa was the proud owner of his prey. He had been spearfishing before, but it wasn't the same as this, and this fish was much bigger. Machwa decided he should hang it from the poles by the water so everyone could see it. It was twice as big as the 3 fish they'd eaten earlier, according to Saruth. Even though it was just a fish, Machwa felt he had caught something more. By the time Machwa had his 4th fish, the servants of Alida de Roth were right beside him. They watched his every movement as he worked the line and taught them as he worked, making sure to show them how to draw the fish to bite and then set the hook. The simple method seemed to elude the men at first, but Machwa made it clear over time. He smiled later as he watched one of them hook and drag in a small fish. The servant held it up for Lady de Roth to see. She glared and commented about the small size of the catch. Machwa tugged at the servant's tunic, and when the man leaned down to listen, he whispered in his ear that he should charge 5 silver pieces for the fish. The servant laughed and handed the fish to Machwa.
"String this for me when you string yours."
Machwa nodded and made a show of placing them together between the poles. Saruth let Machwa do as he pleased with the fish as long as he didn't give or sell them to Alida de Roth. One of the travelers suggested to Machwa that he sell each cooked fish for a silver piece, and he did so. After a while, when the sun was high, Tiljapa returned from an outing and heard the jingle of coins falling into Machwa's money pouch. He came upon a standing rack in the shade of the swamp trees that had many fish hanging from it. Nearby was a small crowd of travelers eating fish from skewers. He blinked at Saruth and Machwa as he noticed them turning fish over the fire. Machwa grinned at him.
"Hey, Tiljapa, come here."
Tiljapa perked an ear and walked over.
"Yes?"
Machwa handed him a large fish on a skewer and added a few dashes of spice before he stepped back.
"Yours is free."
He lifted a brow at the man and inched forward with his nose twitching. His whiskers splayed as Tiljapa took a bite of the fish. Tiljapa's expression became one of delight.
"Did you cook this?"
Machwa nodded.
"Saruth showed me how."
Chiljapa grinned at Saruth.
Your student is an excellent learner. This is delicious.
Machwa smiled one of the biggest smiles he had in quite a while. Chiljapa asked him where Shimna was.
He licked his nose and pointed to the tent. I think she's still sleeping.
Do you want to wake her? If she were downwind of this, she would already be awake.
Machwa nodded and went into the tent to find Shimna. She was there, spread out like she was in free fall over several sleeping furs. He moved closer to her, not bothering to be quiet because she slept like the dead. He held a fish on a skewer next to her nose and blew the scent in her face. For a moment there was nothing. Then her tongue moved over her lips and she opened her eyes to stare at the fish.
For me?
Machwa nodded and handed it to her as he sat down, and she sat up. She took a bite from the fish.
Who made this?
Machwa hooked a thumb toward his chest, puffed it out, and grinned. It lasted about 2 seconds because by that time he was swatting to protect himself from evil licking with fish-scented cooties. Akth!